The wind cut through the trees like a blade, and Elena was already running before she understood why. She had heard it only once, a thin, broken sound, swallowed almost instantly by the storm, but her body had reacted before her mind caught up. A cry, a child's cry, out here, in the middle of nowhere, in snow that had buried the trail behind her within minutes. Her fingers were numb, around the bundle of firewood she had been gathering, and she dropped it without a second thought. The wood scattered across the white ground, forgotten. She turned toward the sound, straining to hear it again over the howling wind, telling herself she had imagined it. No one brought a baby out here. Not in this cold. Not in this storm. Then it came again, sharper this time, closer, and every instinct in her body told her to run toward it. Elena was not supposed to run toward anything. She was not supposed to draw attention, not supposed to act first and think later, not supposed to matter enough for anyone to notice what she did. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in a pack that had made her feel small every day for the last 6 years, and Omegas who stepped out of line paid for it. She knew this. She had learned it the hard way, more than once. But the cry came a third time, weaker now, and something in her chest cracked open. She pushed through a wall of low branches, snow falling in clumps down the back of her coat, and stumbled into a small clearing where the wind seemed to pause just long enough for her to see clearly. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow against the white. Then she saw the shape of a bundle, wrapped in fur, half buried already, and inside it, impossibly small, a baby. For a moment Elena could not move. The world around her seemed to hold its breath, the storm losing its violence, the trees leaning in, as if they too were watching to see what she would do. Then the baby cried again, and Elena's body decided for her. She crossed the clearing in a few long strides, and dropped to her knees in the snow, scooping the bundle up before the cold could take another second of the child's warmth. The fur wrapping was fine, finer than anything Elena had ever touched, dyed a deep blue and stitched with a pattern she didn't recognize, a crescent moon, curled beneath a small crown. She had no idea what it meant. She only knew the baby's lips had turned faintly blue, and that if she didn't get this child somewhere warm within minutes, none of the rest would matter. She tucked the baby against her chest, opening her coat despite the biting wind, letting her own body heat wrap around the small shivering form. The baby's face was red from crying, tiny fists curled tight, and as Elena adjusted her hold, one of those fists shot out and closed around her wrist. The grip was startlingly strong for something so small. Elena barely had time to register the strangeness of it before pain exploded up her arm, a burning heat that had nothing to do with the cold. She gasped, nearly dropping the child, her vision flashing white at the edges. It felt like fire tracing lines into her skin, deliberate lines, shapes forming beneath the surface, as if something ancient had been waiting for exactly this moment to wake up. She looked down at her wrist and stopped breathing entirely. A mark glowed there, faint gold light pulsing beneath her skin, in the shape of a crescent moon wrapped around a small crown, the very same symbol stitched into the baby's fur. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, and it did not fade the way she expected pain to fade. It settled, it sank into her, warm now instead of burning, as though it had always belonged there and was only now being revealed. The baby, strangely, had stopped crying. Tiny eyes blinked up at Elena, calm now, almost curious, as if satisfied by whatever had just happened. Elena's mind raced through every story she had ever heard about marks like this, every whispered rumor passed between Omegas who weren't supposed to know anything about the politics of packs above their station. She had heard of the Alpha King's personal seal, a mark reserved for members of his bloodline and the rare individuals chosen to protect them. But she had always assumed those stories were exaggerated, half myth, the kind of thing pack elders told young pups to make the world feel larger than the fences around their territory. She stared at her wrist, at the impossible glow slowly fading into something like a tattoo, permanent and undeniable, and understood with sudden clarity that whatever this was, it was not a myth. It was real, and it had just happened to her, an Omega with no family, no rank, and no one who would believe her if she tried to explain it. The wind picked up again, sharp and biting, snapping her back into the moment. She could examine the mark later. Right now the baby needed shelter, and so did she. Elena rose from the snow, cradling the child against her chest, and looked around the clearing for any sign of who might have left a baby out here, in a storm, wrapped in fur too fine for anyone in her pack to own. There were footprints, she realized, half filled with snow already, leading away into the trees in the opposite direction from her own trail. Someone had been here recently. Someone had left this child behind on purpose, or had been forced to. She didn't have time to wonder which. The trek back to her small cabin, at the edge of the pack's territory, felt longer than it ever had before, every step slowed by the drifting snow and the need to shield the baby from the worst of the wind. Elena kept one arm curled protectively around the small bundle, using her body as a wall against the storm, murmuring soft nonsense words to keep the baby calm, though she wasn't entirely sure why it mattered so much to her that the child stay calm. She barely knew this baby existed 20 minutes ago, and yet something about the weight of it against her chest felt like it had always been there. By the time her cabin came into view through the swirling white, her legs ached and her lungs burned with each breath. She pushed the door open with her shoulder and stumbled inside, kicking it shut behind her against the wind, and only then let herself exhale. The cabin was small and plain, barely more than one room, with a narrow bed, a stove, and a stack of furs Elena used more for warmth than comfort. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and right now that was all that mattered. She laid the baby down gently on the bed and hurried to stoke the stove, feeding it wood with shaking hands until the flames caught and the room began to fill with heat. Only when she was certain the baby was safe and warming did Elena allow herself to sit back and truly look at her wrist. The mark had settled into her skin like it had always been there, a crescent moon and crown rendered in fine, elegant lines, gold-toned even against her pale skin. It did not look like a scar or a burn. It looked deliberate, crafted, the kind of mark a jeweler might spend years perfecting. She traced it with her opposite hand, half expecting it to smear or fade under her touch, but it held firm, warm beneath her fingers. She had heard the stories. Every pack member had, in one form or another. The Alpha King ruled over all the packs, his authority absolute, his bloodline protected by marks that appeared only when someone was recognized as a true guardian or mate. Elena had always assumed those stories were meant to keep lower ranks in line, reminders that greatness belonged only to the chosen few and had nothing to do with people like her. And yet here she was, an Omega, with a king's mark burned into her wrist, holding a baby who had somehow caused it to appear. She looked over at the child, now sleeping peacefully on her narrow bed, small chest rising and falling steadily, color returning to her tiny face. Elena studied the delicate features, trying to see some resemblance to anyone she might recognize, some hint of who this baby belonged to, and why she had been left in the snow to die. She found nothing familiar, only innocence, and a strange, undeniable sense that this baby's survival now mattered more to Elena than her own. That thought alone frightened her more than the mark did. Elena had learned a long time ago not to let herself care too deeply about anything within pack territory. Caring made you vulnerable. Caring gave others leverage over you, a lesson she had learned first from her own pack's dismissive treatment of Omegas, and later, from watching others suffer for daring to want something more than survival. She had built her life around not needing anyone, and not letting anyone need her. And now a baby she had known for less than an hour had cracked that foundation completely. She spent the rest of the evening watching the baby sleep, feeding the fire, and trying to piece together what she knew. The fur wrapping bore a crest she didn't recognize, though something about its craftsmanship suggested wealth and status far beyond anything in her own pack. The footprints leading away from the clearing suggested the child had not simply wandered off alone, which meant someone, deliberately or under duress, had left her there. If the baby belonged to the Alpha King's bloodline, as the mark suggested, then whoever left her in that snow either wanted her found by exactly the right person, or wanted her gone entirely, and hadn't cared who found her, or didn't find her at all. Elena didn't like either possibility. She thought about reporting the discovery to her pack's leadership, as protocol technically required, but stopped herself almost immediately. Her Alpha had never once looked out for her interests, and there was no reason to believe he would treat a mysterious royal infant, or an Omega suddenly marked by the king himself, any differently than he treated everything else that threatened his comfortable position. If word got out that Elena carried the Alpha King's mark, she doubted her own pack would protect her. More likely, someone would try to use her, sell information about her, or worse, decide she was a problem to be removed quietly, before it became someone else's business to deal with. The wind rattled the cabin's single window, and Elena pulled the furs higher around the sleeping baby, glancing instinctively toward the door, as though someone might already be outside listening. No one was, she told herself, not yet. But she understood, with the same sharp clarity that had sent her running toward a stranger's cry in the middle of a storm, that her life had just changed, in ways she could not yet fully measure. She was no longer simply an overlooked omega surviving at the edges of pack life. She was marked, she was connected, however unwillingly, to a child who might be royalty, and to a king she had never met, but whose seal now lived permanently on her skin. She did not know yet whether that mark made her protected, or made her a target. She only knew that either way, there was no undoing what had happened in that clearing. Elena stayed awake long into the night, listening to the storm slowly weaken outside, watching the baby breathe steadily beside her, and turning the crescent and crown mark over and over in her mind. Somewhere out there, someone knew this child was missing. Somewhere out there, someone had left footprints leading away from a dying baby in the snow. And somewhere out there was a king who would eventually learn that his mark had chosen an omega no one had ever thought worth noticing. She had no way of knowing it yet, but by morning, her quiet, invisible life would be over completely, and there would be no going back to the person she had been before she heard that first cry in the storm. For now, though, she simply held the baby close, felt the warmth of small breaths against her collarbone, and allowed herself, just this once, to believe that she had done the right thing. The fire crackled low in the stove. The wind outside began to fade into a gentler hush. And Elena, exhausted beyond measure, finally let her eyes close, unaware that far away, in a stronghold carved into the mountains, a king had just felt a mark of his own bloodline ignite somewhere in the world, and had already given the order to find it. Morning came pale and quiet, the storm having spent itself some time before dawn, leaving behind a world buried in fresh snow. Elena woke with a start, her hand instinctively reaching for the baby before her eyes even opened, relief flooding through her when she felt the small, warm body still tucked safely against her side. The baby was awake, staring up at the ceiling with wide, curious eyes, making soft, contented sounds that Elena found strangely calming. She sat up slowly, careful not to jostle the child, and looked down at her wrist again, half hoping the mark had somehow disappeared overnight, a trick of exhaustion and fear, rather than something real and permanent. It hadn't disappeared. If anything, in the morning light, it looked even clearer, the gold lines catching the pale sun streaming through her window. She spent the next hour doing what she could to care for the baby properly, warming a bit of goat's milk she kept for emergencies, wrapping the child in a spare blanket since the royal fur seemed too fine to risk damaging, and trying to ignore the growing unease settling in her stomach. Someone would come looking, she was certain of it. The only question was who, and whether they would come as friends or enemies. She didn't have to wait long to find out. The sound of footsteps outside, crunching through snow with purposeful weight, sent Elena's heart into her throat. She grabbed the baby instinctively, pressing the child close, and moved toward the small window to see who approached. What she saw made her blood run cold. 3 figures moved toward her cabin, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark-fitted coats that marked them immediately as pack enforcers, though not from her own pack. She didn't recognize the insignia stitched into their collars, a stylized wolf head beneath a crown, but she understood instinctively that these were not ordinary wolves. These were soldiers, and soldiers meant trouble. Her first instinct was to run, but running with a baby through knee-deep snow would accomplish nothing, except exhausting them both before they got anywhere. Her second instinct, the one she trusted more, told her that if these men wanted to hurt her, they would not have announced their approach so openly. They could have surrounded the cabin silently if stealth had been their goal. Still, her hands trembled as she watched them stop a respectful distance from her door. The knock, when it came, was measured and polite, nothing like the aggressive pounding she might have expected from enforcers with bad intentions. Elena hesitated only a moment before opening the door, keeping the baby shielded behind her body as best she could. The 3 men outside were unlike anyone she had encountered in her own pack's territory. They stood with a kind of discipline that suggested years of training, their expressions unreadable, though Elena noticed something shift in their posture the instant their eyes landed on her wrist, which she had not thought to cover. The tallest of the three, a man with steel-gray eyes and a scar cutting across one eyebrow, was the first to speak. His voice was low, controlled, carrying an authority that made Elena's instincts scream at her to lower her gaze, though she forced herself not to. He introduced himself simply as Nolan, captain of the king's personal guard, and explained with careful, measured words that they had been tracking the missing child since the previous evening, when word reached the stronghold that the king's niece had disappeared during an attack on her convoy. Elena's breath caught at the word niece. Whatever she had imagined about this baby's origins, hearing it confirmed so plainly, still struck her like a physical blow. Nolan's gaze dropped briefly to Elena's wrist again, and something like genuine astonishment flickered across his otherwise composed face. He explained, gently but firmly, that the mark she now carried was not something that could be faked or forced. It was the king's own bloodline recognition, a bond that only appeared when someone was deemed, by forces older and stranger than any pack law, worthy of protecting a member of the royal family. Elena listened, her arms tightening protectively around the baby, uncertain whether to feel relieved or more frightened than before. If these men spoke truthfully, then she was no longer simply an Omega who had stumbled into danger. She was now tied, permanently and undeniably, to the most powerful bloodline in the region. She asked, voice steadier than she felt, what would happen now? Nolan's answer was simple and immediate. She and the child would need to come with them, to the king's stronghold, where the baby could be properly protected, and where the king himself would need to see the mark with his own eyes. Elena hesitated, leaving her pack's territory, however little it had ever done for her, still felt like stepping off the edge of everything familiar, into a void she couldn't measure. But staying here, in a small unprotected cabin, with a target on her back and a baby who needed real safety, was not truly a choice at all. She gathered what little she owned, wrapped the baby securely against the cold, and stepped out into the snow behind three strangers, who claimed to serve a king she had never met, walking away from the only life she had known, toward a future she could not yet imagine. The journey to the stronghold took the better part of the day, first through the forest trails Elena knew, then along wider roads maintained for pack transport, and finally up a winding mountain path that led toward towering stone walls she had only ever heard described in stories. The stronghold rose out of the mountainside like something carved by giants, imposing and ancient, banners bearing the crescent and crown crest snapping in the cold wind atop its highest towers. Elena's legs ached from the long walk, and the baby had grown fussy despite her best efforts to keep her calm, but nothing prepared her for the sheer scale of what awaited them at the gates. Guards straightened to attention as their small group approached, murmurs rippling through the assembled staff and soldiers, as word spread ahead of them that the missing child had been found, and that an unknown Omega bore the king's mark. Elena felt every eye on her as they passed through the gates, felt the weight of curious and suspicious stares alike, and fought the urge to shrink into herself the way she had trained her body to do for years, within her own pack. She reminded herself, with each step, that whatever waited inside these walls, she had done nothing wrong. She had saved a child's life. Whatever came next, she would face it honestly. They were led through corridors far grander than anything Elena had ever seen, stone walls softened by tapestries and firelight, the air itself seeming to hum with power and history. Finally, they arrived at a set of massive wooden doors, carved with the same crescent and crown symbol that marked her wrist, and Nolan turned to her with an expression that was almost, though not quite, sympathetic. He told her quietly that the king was waiting inside, and that his mood since the child's disappearance had not been forgiving. He advised her simply to speak the truth, exactly as it had happened, and let the mark speak for itself. Elena swallowed hard, adjusted the baby in her arms, and nodded. The doors opened, and she stepped forward into whatever judgment awaited her, carrying a king's niece and a mark she had never asked for, into a room where the most powerful man in the region stood waiting to decide her fate. The room beyond the doors was vast, lit by tall windows and a fire large enough to warm the entire space, but Elena barely registered any of it. Her attention locked immediately onto the man standing near the fire, his back turned, shoulders rigid with a tension that seemed to fill the entire chamber. When he turned to face her, Elena understood at once why every guard in this stronghold moved with such careful discipline. King Damien carried himself with a presence that pressed against the room like a physical force. Dark eyes sharp and assessing, jaw set with the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in days. He looked, Elena thought, like a man holding himself together through sheer will alone. His gaze moved first to the baby in her arms, and something in his expression cracked, just slightly. Relief and fury tangled together in a way Elena recognized instantly. This was not simply his niece. This was someone he loved, someone he had feared losing completely. He crossed the room in a few long strides, and Elena instinctively tightened her hold on the child, though she forced herself to stand her ground rather than retreat. Damien stopped before her, close enough that she could see the fine tremor in his hands as he reached for the baby, and Elena, after only a heartbeat's hesitation, allowed him to take her. The moment the baby settled into her uncle's arms, she let out a soft, happy sound, small fists reaching for his face, and Elena watched something in Damien's expression soften completely, if only for a moment. That moment did not last long. He looked up from the baby to Elena, and the warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by cold suspicion. His gaze dropped to her wrist, to the mark still glowing faintly gold against her skin, and his jaw tightened further. He asked her, voice low and controlled but carrying an unmistakable edge, how an unranked Omega from a minor pack territory had come to be holding his niece, wearing his family's mark, less than a day after she had been stolen from a heavily guarded convoy. Elena felt heat rise to her face, though she refused to let her voice shake as she answered. She told him plainly what had happened, the storm, the cry in the snow, the footprints leading away into the trees, the way the mark had appeared, the instant the baby's hand closed around her wrist. She left nothing out, offered no excuses, simply stated the truth as clearly as she could manage. Damien listened without interrupting, but Elena could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, could practically watch him weighing every possibility, including the very real possibility that she was lying, that she was somehow connected to whoever had orchestrated the attack on the convoy in the first place. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself not to. Finally, he asked her directly whether she had any connection to anyone who might wish harm to his family, any allegiance to rival packs, any reason at all that she might have known where to find an abandoned royal child in the middle of a storm. Elena answered honestly that she had none. She explained, without self-pity but without hiding the truth either, that she was an Omega, with no standing in her own pack, someone barely acknowledged by her own alpha, let alone connected to any conspiracy large enough to threaten a king's bloodline. She had been gathering firewood. She had heard a cry. She had acted without thinking, the way anyone with a conscience would have acted. Damien's expression did not soften, not entirely, but something in his posture shifted slightly, as though he had expected a more polished, more suspicious answer, and her plain honesty had thrown him off balance. He turned his attention back to the baby, who continued to reach for his face with small, insistent hands, then glanced back toward Elena's wrist one more time, studying the mark as though he might find some hidden flaw in it, if he looked hard enough. He told her, finally, that the mark could not be faked. Every advisor and healer in the stronghold would confirm as much, though he intended to have them examine her anyway, along with a full account of everything that had happened, cross-referenced against whatever evidence his trackers gathered from the site where she found the child. Until then, she would remain within the stronghold, under guard, neither fully a prisoner nor fully a guest. Elena accepted this without argument. She understood, better than most, what it meant to be trusted only conditionally, to have to prove her worth again and again before being granted even basic consideration. It was, in some strange way, familiar ground. What she did not expect was the baby's reaction when Nolan stepped forward to escort Elena to separate quarters. The moment Elena moved to hand the child fully into someone else's care, the baby's calm expression crumpled, small face turning red as she began to wail, reaching insistently past Damien's shoulder toward Elena. The sound cut through the room, sharp and distressed, and Elena watched Damien's expression shift from suspicion to something closer to genuine confusion. He tried to soothe the baby himself, rocking her gently, murmuring low reassurances, but nothing worked. The crying only intensified. Reluctantly, uncertainly, he looked to Elena. She stepped forward without waiting for permission, and took the baby back into her arms, and almost instantly, the crying subsided into soft, hiccuping breaths, small hands curling into the fabric of Elena's coat, as though anchoring herself there. The room fell silent except for the crackling fire, everyone present clearly processing what they had just witnessed. Elena felt Damien's eyes on her, no longer purely suspicious now, but something more complicated, something closer to reluctant reassessment. He said nothing for a long moment, simply watching the baby settle against Elena's chest, before finally speaking again, his voice quieter than before. He told her that for now, given the child's evident attachment, Elena would remain close to the baby's quarters, under guard but not confined, while his people completed their investigation. It was not trust, not yet. But it was, Elena understood, a small crack in the wall of suspicion he had built the moment she walked through those doors, and for now, that would have to be enough. As guards escorted her from the room, baby still held securely against her chest, Elena allowed herself a single glance back toward the king, who stood watching her go, with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between wariness and something far more uncertain. She had survived the first test. She had no illusions that it would be the last. The quarters given to Elena were modest by the stronghold's standards, but grander than anything she had ever lived in. A small suite, with a proper bed for the baby, thick furs against the mountain cold, and a window that looked out over snow-covered peaks, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. She spent that first night barely sleeping, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the fortress settling around her, the distant murmur of guards changing shifts, the wind pressing against ancient stone walls that had stood for generations before she was ever born. The baby, whose name she learned the next morning was Lily, slept soundly beside her, apparently unbothered by the dramatic change in circumstances that had upended both their lives within the span of a single day. Elena envied that simplicity, even as she watched over the child with quiet devotion, still trying to process everything that had happened since she first heard that cry in the storm. Morning brought a healer, a composed older woman named Marisol, who examined Elena's wrist with careful, practiced hands, murmuring softly to herself as she studied the mark from every angle. She confirmed, much as Damien had predicted, that the mark bore all the hallmarks of authentic bloodline recognition, a bond that could not be replicated through any known trick or deception. She explained, gently, that such marks appeared perhaps once in a generation, and always in response to genuine need, genuine worthiness, qualities that could not be faked, no matter how skilled the deceiver. Elena absorbed this information quietly, uncertain what to do with the knowledge that something ancient and powerful had judged her worthy of something, when for years, her own pack had judged her worth almost nothing at all. The days that followed settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm. Elena remained largely confined to the wing of the stronghold near Lily's nursery, permitted to move freely within certain boundaries, but always trailed by at least one guard, a quiet reminder that her presence here remained conditional. She didn't resent the arrangement. She understood caution, understood the weight of what had happened to this family, and found herself, despite everything, growing genuinely attached to the small child who refused to settle for anyone else's care. It was during the fourth day that the first sign of danger appeared. Elena had taken Lily for a short walk through one of the stronghold's inner courtyards, escorted as always by a guard, when she noticed a member of the kitchen staff watching her with unusual intensity from a nearby doorway. The man's expression held none of the curiosity or wariness Elena had grown used to from the rest of the staff. Instead, his eyes tracked her movements with a calculating focus that sent a cold prickle down her spine. She said nothing at the time, telling herself she was simply unused to being watched so closely, that her nerves were running away with her imagination. But that evening, as she prepared Lily for bed, she noticed her food tray had been left unattended for several minutes longer than usual before a servant delivered it, and something about the timing nagged at her instincts. She did not eat that night, choosing instead to feed Lily from a separate supply Marisol had provided specifically for the baby, and quietly disposed of her own untouched meal the following morning. She mentioned the incident to Nolan the next time he checked on her quarters, expecting perhaps mild reassurance that she was simply overthinking things. Instead, his expression turned serious immediately, and he asked several pointed questions about exactly which servant had delivered the tray and how long it had been left unattended. That evening, Elena was summoned back to the great hall where she had first met Damien. He looked no less exhausted than before, though something in his manner had shifted since their first encounter, a wariness that now seemed directed less at her and more at the walls of his own fortress. He informed her, without preamble, that the servant she had noticed watching her had been questioned and found to have connections to a member of his inner council, an advisor named Victor Kane, who had grown increasingly vocal in recent months about concerns regarding the stability of the bloodline succession following the attack on Lily's convoy. Elena listened carefully, piecing together the implications. If someone within the king's own council had orchestrated the attack that led to Lily being abandoned in the snow, then whoever it was had likely intended for the child to die out there, unmarked and unclaimed, removing a threat to whatever ambitions they harbored. Elena's survival of the child and the appearance of the mark on her own wrist had thrown a wrench into those plans in a way no one could have anticipated. Which meant, Damien explained grimly, that Elena herself had likely become a target, not because of anything she had done, but simply because her existence now stood as inconvenient proof that Lily still lived, protected by a bond that could not easily be undone. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She thought of the untouched food tray, of the servant's calculating stare, and understood with sudden clarity that her arrival at this stronghold had not ended the danger she and Lily faced. It had simply changed its shape. Damien watched her absorb this information, and for the first time since she had walked through those doors, his expression held something other than suspicion or wariness. It looked, unmistakably, like concern, directed not at the political complications her presence created, but at her safety specifically. He told her, voice quieter than she had yet heard it, that he would be doubling the guard around her quarters immediately, and that until Victor Kane's involvement could be confirmed or disproven, she was not to accept food, drink, or any item from staff members she did not personally recognize. Elena nodded, throat tight with the sudden realization of just how precarious her position had become. She had come to this stronghold carrying a baby and a mysterious mark, uncertain of her welcome. Now she understood she was carrying something far more dangerous, proof of a conspiracy that someone powerful enough to reach into the king's own household was willing to kill to keep hidden. As she left the great hall that night, escorted by 2 guards instead of 1, she found herself thinking not of her own fear, but of Lily, sleeping peacefully in her nursery, utterly unaware of how many people now wished either to protect her or to erase her entirely. Elena resolved, in that quiet moment walking through torchlit corridors, that whatever came next, she would not let anyone succeed in the second option. She had run toward that cry in the snow without hesitation. She would not hesitate now either. 2 weeks passed inside the stronghold, and Elena slowly began to understand the rhythms of a life she had never imagined for herself. She learned the names of the guards who watched over her quarters, learned which servants she could trust and which ones still eyed her with open suspicion, and learned, most importantly, how to navigate the delicate politics of a court that had not yet decided what to make of her. Damien sought her out more frequently than she expected, always under the guise of discussing Lily's well-being or reviewing the ongoing investigation into Victor Kane, but Elena began to notice small things that suggested his visits carried more weight than mere duty. He remembered details about her that she had only mentioned once in passing. He arrived at times when Lily was most likely to be awake and cheerful, rather than fussy or tired. He lingered, sometimes, in ways that had nothing to do with politics or security. She told herself she was imagining it, that a king as guarded and burdened as Damien had no reason to notice an Omega he had only grudgingly allowed to remain in his household, but the evidence accumulated slowly, undeniably, until she could no longer dismiss it as simple imagination. One evening, as autumn light faded into the deep blue of mountain dusk, Damien found her in the small garden courtyard, where she often brought Lily for fresh air before bedtime. He didn't announce his presence with the usual formality of guards or advisors. He simply appeared beside her, watching Lily reach for a fluttering moth with the single-minded determination only a baby could summon, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. When he finally did speak, his voice carried none of the cold authority she had grown used to. He told her, quietly, that Marisol had informed him of the sleepless nights Elena had spent those first weeks, watching over Lily, even when guards stood posted at every door, refusing to fully trust anyone else with the child's safety, despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face. Elena, caught off guard by his uncharacteristic gentleness, admitted honestly that she hadn't known how to stop. Lily had become, in the strangest and most unexpected way, someone she could not imagine failing. Damien was quiet for a moment, watching the baby's determined pursuit of the moth, before admitting something Elena hadn't expected. He confessed that in the days immediately following the attack on the convoy, before Elena had found Lily in the snow, he had barely allowed himself to hope that his niece still lived. He had prepared himself, in the coldest, most practical corner of his mind, for the possibility that she was already gone, and that he would need to focus his energy entirely on rooting out whoever had orchestrated the attack, rather than holding on to false hope. Elena's own life, he admitted, quietly and without the guarded suspicion of their first meeting, had disrupted every plan he made for how to survive that grief. He had not expected an unranked Omega from a minor pack territory to be the one who changed everything. The admission hung in the cool evening air between them, more vulnerable than anything Elena had yet heard from him, and she found herself, despite every instinct telling her to remain cautious, softening toward him in a way that frightened her almost as much as the mark on her wrist had that first night in the snow. She told him, carefully, that she understood grief, understood what it meant to prepare yourself for loss because hoping for anything better felt too dangerous. She had lived most of her life expecting very little, because expecting little meant disappointment couldn't cut quite as deep. Damien turned to look at her fully then, something raw and searching in his expression, and asked whether that was still true, whether she still expected so little from the world around her, even now. Elena, watching Lily giggle at the moth that had finally settled on a nearby flower, found she didn't have an easy answer. Everything about her circumstances had changed so rapidly, so completely, that the careful emotional walls she had spent years constructing felt increasingly difficult to maintain. She admitted, quietly, that she wasn't certain anymore what she expected, only that whatever came next, she intended to face it honestly, without pretending to be less capable or less deserving than she actually was. Something shifted in Damien's expression at that answer, a kind of quiet respect that Elena had not seen directed at her before, not from him, not from anyone within her own pack, not from anyone at all, in longer than she could remember. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Nolan, whose urgent expression immediately dispelled the soft, fragile intimacy that had settled over the courtyard. He reported that new evidence had surfaced regarding Victor Kane, evidence significant enough that Damien needed to review it immediately. Damien's expression hardened back into the guarded authority Elena had grown used to, though he lingered a moment longer than necessary, before following Nolan inside, glancing back at her and Lily, with an expression she couldn't quite name. Elena remained in the courtyard a while longer, gathering Lily into her arms, as the evening chill deepened, turning over everything Damien had said in her mind. Whatever was happening between them, whatever fragile understanding had begun to form in the space of a single conversation, she knew better than to assume it changed anything about the dangers still surrounding them. Victor Kane remained free, his loyalties and intentions still uncertain, and somewhere within these very walls, someone had already tried once to remove Elena from the equation entirely. She would need every bit of caution she had left, even as something warmer, and far more complicated, continued to grow in the space Damien's honesty had opened between them. She carried Lily back inside as the last light faded from the mountain sky, unaware that the evidence Nolan had rushed to deliver would soon change everything she thought she understood about who truly threatened them, and how close that danger had already come. The evidence Nolan brought that evening painted a picture more troubling than anyone had anticipated. Documents recovered from a courier intercepted near the northern border revealed correspondence between Victor Kane and an unknown contact, discussing payment for what the letters vaguely referred to as removing an obstacle to the succession. The dates aligned precisely with the attack on Lily's convoy, and further correspondence suggested Victor's ambitions extended beyond simply eliminating Lily. He intended, it seemed, to position himself as the primary advisor to whichever distant relative might inherit the throne, in the absence of a direct heir, a plan that depended entirely on Lily never being found alive. Elena learned of this development the following morning, when Damien summoned her not to the Great Hall this time, but to a smaller private study lined with books and maps, a room that felt far more personal than anywhere else she had been permitted within the stronghold. He explained the contents of the intercepted letters carefully, watching her reaction as though gauging something beyond her simple understanding of the facts. She listened with growing unease, understanding now with complete clarity why the servant, who had watched her so intently in the courtyard, had unnerved her so deeply, why her food tray had been left unattended just long enough for tampering, why every instinct she possessed had screamed at her that something was deeply wrong. Victor Kane, Damien explained grimly, remained unaware that his correspondence had been intercepted. This gave them a narrow advantage, an opportunity to gather further proof of his involvement, before he realized his plans had been discovered, and either fled or accelerated whatever scheme he still intended to carry out. Elena asked, carefully, what role she might play in that plan. She had noticed things during her time in the stronghold, small inconsistencies in staff behavior, patterns of movement that seemed deliberate rather than incidental, details that someone less accustomed to watching for danger might have overlooked entirely. Years of navigating a pack that valued her opinion so little had taught her, unintentionally, how to observe without being noticed, how to piece together truths that others missed, simply because no one expected her to be paying attention at all. Damien studied her for a long moment, something like genuine consideration crossing his features, before admitting that her insight might indeed prove valuable. He had grown so accustomed to being watched himself, so used to every movement within his own household being calculated for political effect, that he had lost the ability to see his own staff clearly. Elena, an outsider with nothing to gain from deception, might notice exactly what he had been missing. Over the following days, Elena found herself drawn increasingly into the investigation, quietly observing interactions between staff members, noting who spent unusual amounts of time near Victor Kane's private chambers, who seemed nervous or evasive when questioned about routine matters. She reported her observations to Nolan each evening, and slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge of a network extending further than anyone had initially suspected. Working alongside Damien's people gave Elena a strange sense of purpose she had never experienced within her own pack, where her contributions had always been dismissed or ignored, regardless of their value. Here, her careful attention to detail was taken seriously, weighed against other evidence, sometimes proving decisive in ways that visibly surprised even Nolan, who had initially treated her involvement as little more than a courtesy extended to appease Lily's evident attachment to her. Damien's attitude toward her continued shifting as the investigation progressed, the wary suspicion of their first meeting replaced increasingly by something that looked, unmistakably, like respect. He began seeking her opinion not just on matters directly related to Lily's safety, but on broader questions of strategy, curious what someone who had spent years navigating a pack's rigid hierarchy from its lowest position might see that his more privileged advisors had missed. It was during one of these late evening discussions, poring over documents by firelight in his private study, that the true danger of their situation revealed itself in the most immediate way possible. Elena had just pointed out a discrepancy in the guard rotation schedules, a pattern that suggested Victor Kane's contact within the stronghold had access to information typically reserved for senior staff, when the study door burst open without warning. A guard Elena recognized only vaguely rushed in, face pale with urgency, reporting that an intruder had been discovered near Lily's nursery, having somehow bypassed the outer perimeter guards entirely. Elena's blood turned to ice. She was on her feet before she consciously decided to move, every instinct screaming at her to reach Lily immediately, and Damien was right beside her, his earlier composure replaced by the same fierce urgency she felt herself. They reached the nursery within minutes, hearts pounding, to find the intruder already subdued, pinned to the ground by two guards who had responded to the alarm. Elena rushed past them to where Marisol stood protectively over Lily's crib, relief crashing through her when she saw the baby sleeping peacefully, apparently unharmed and unaware of how close danger had come. The intruder, when questioned, revealed under Damien's furious interrogation that he had been sent specifically to eliminate Lily, before the investigation into Victor Kane's activities could progress any further, confirming everything the intercepted letters had suggested, and revealing, more urgently, that Victor Kane had somehow learned his correspondence had been compromised. Elena stood in the nursery that night, watching Lily sleep, hands still trembling from adrenaline, and understood with complete clarity that whatever careful timeline they had hoped to follow in exposing Victor Kane's treachery had just been shattered entirely. He knew he had been discovered. Whatever he intended to do next, he would do it soon, and desperately. Damien found her there sometime later, after the intruder had been taken away for further questioning, after the immediate chaos had settled into tense, watchful quiet. He stood beside her at Lily's crib, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the mountain chill seeping through the nursery windows. He told her, voice low and rough with an emotion she hadn't heard from him before, that he could not have borne losing Lily a second time, and that somewhere in the past weeks, his gratitude toward Elena had grown into something far more complicated than simple gratitude alone. Elena turned to look at him, heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the danger they had just narrowly avoided, and found herself unable to look away from the raw honesty in his expression. Neither of them spoke further that night. But something had shifted permanently between them, standing together over the crib of the child who had brought them into each other's lives in the first place, and Elena understood that whatever came next, in the confrontation with Victor Kane that now felt inevitable, she would face it not as an outsider merely tolerated within these walls, but as someone Damien had come to trust completely. The days following the failed attempt on Lily's life moved with a tension Elena had never experienced before. Every corner of the stronghold now charged with a wary alertness that touched everyone, from the highest-ranking guards to the youngest kitchen staff. Damien had ordered a full lockdown of the fortress, sealing every entrance except those directly monitored by his most trusted soldiers, while Nolan led an aggressive search for any further evidence of Victor Kane's remaining allies within the household. Elena found herself at the center of increasingly urgent strategy sessions, her observations from the previous weeks now examined with renewed intensity, as everyone scrambled to identify exactly how deep Victor's network extended. She provided detailed accounts of every interaction she had noticed, every servant who had seemed nervous or evasive, cross-referencing her memories against the guard rotation schedules and staff assignments that Nolan's people compiled. It was during one such session, late into the evening, that Elena noticed something that had been nagging at the edges of her memory since her very first day in the stronghold. She had assumed, initially, that the kitchen worker who had watched her so intently during her first days had simply been curious about the mysterious Omega who had arrived carrying the king's missing niece. But reviewing the timeline more carefully, she realized his behavior had begun before word could have reasonably spread about the mark on her wrist. He had been watching for her arrival specifically, which meant he had known she was coming before almost anyone else in the stronghold. She raised this observation to Damien and Nolan, watching as the implications settled over both their faces. If the kitchen worker had known to expect her, someone had informed him in advance, which meant Victor Kane's network had been aware not just of the attack on the convoy, but of the possibility that a bystander might find and protect the missing child, information that should have been impossible for anyone outside the immediate investigation to know that quickly. The only way that made sense, Elena realized aloud, was if Victor Kane's contact had access to information from within the tracking party itself, someone who had reported Elena's involvement almost immediately after she was first identified, rather than waiting for official confirmation through proper channels. Nolan's expression darkened considerably at this suggestion, and he excused himself immediately to review the movements of everyone who had been present during the initial search for Lily, cross-referencing their reports against the timeline Elena had identified. What he uncovered, when he returned hours later, confirmed their worst suspicions. One of the guards who had originally accompanied Nolan to Elena's cabin, a soldier named Garyon who had served within the stronghold's ranks for several years, had sent an unauthorized message through the Pack's communication network within hours of Elena's discovery, well before any official report had been filed with Damien's counsel. Damien's fury upon learning this was quiet but absolute, a controlled rage that Elena found more unsettling than any outburst might have been. He ordered Garyon detained immediately, and the subsequent interrogation revealed a network far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. Victor Kane had spent months cultivating loyalty among certain members of the guard and household staff, promising positions of power and wealth once his plans for the succession came to fruition, patiently building an infrastructure of betrayal that had gone entirely unnoticed within the very walls meant to protect the royal bloodline. Garyon, faced with the certainty of his own exposure, ultimately provided the location of a hidden meeting Victor Kane had scheduled with his remaining allies, desperate to salvage whatever position he might retain by cooperating fully with the investigation. Damien moved quickly once the information was secured, gathering his most trusted soldiers to intercept the meeting, before Victor Kane could realize his network had been compromised so thoroughly. Elena, despite having no formal training in combat or strategy, found herself included in the final planning discussions, her insight into Victor's likely thinking proving unexpectedly valuable, given how closely she had studied every detail of his suspected involvement over the preceding weeks. She did not ask to join the mission to apprehend Victor Kane directly, understanding that her place remained with Lily, whose safety could not be guaranteed if Elena's attention was divided. But she remained in the Stronghold's command center throughout the operation, watching anxiously as reports filtered back from the soldiers Damien had dispatched, praying silently that whatever confrontation awaited them would end without further violence. The operation, when it finally concluded near dawn, exceeded even Damien's expectations. Victor Kane was apprehended, along with several of his remaining allies, caught in the act of finalizing plans for a more direct assault on the stronghold itself, an assault that would have targeted both Lily and Elena simultaneously, in a desperate final attempt to eliminate every obstacle to his ambitions. Elena felt the weight of exhaustion and relief crash over her simultaneously when Damien returned to the command center, his expression grim but triumphant, confirming that the immediate threat had been neutralized. Victor Kane now sat in the Stronghold's most secure holding cell, awaiting judgment for his betrayal, his carefully constructed network of loyalists exposed and dismantled piece by piece over the following days. But even as relief settled over the household, Elena could not shake a lingering unease. Victor Kane had spoken, during his initial interrogation, of a final contingency, a backup plan he had put in place should his primary schemes fail, details he refused to reveal, despite increasingly urgent questioning. Damien assured her, that evening, that his people would uncover whatever contingency Victor had hinted at before it could pose any real danger. But Elena, watching Lily sleep peacefully in her crib, unable to fully release the tension that had gripped her for weeks now, found herself unable to share his confidence entirely. Something told her, with the same instinctive certainty that had once sent her running toward a stranger's cry in the snow, that the danger surrounding them was not yet fully over, and that whatever Victor Kane had left unfinished would demand every bit of strength she and Damien had built together in the weeks since that first desperate night. In the weeks that followed Victor Kane's capture, a fragile sense of normalcy began to settle over the stronghold, though Elena never fully let her guard down. Victor's cryptic mention of a final contingency lingering at the back of her mind even as daily life within the fortress grew steadily calmer. Damien's counsel worked tirelessly to unravel the remaining threads of Victor's conspiracy, questioning every guard and staff member with any possible connection to the network, gradually restoring a sense of security to a household that had spent months living under the shadow of betrayal. Through it all, Elena's role within the stronghold continued evolving in ways she could never have anticipated during those first frightened days after finding Lily in the snow. She was no longer simply the Omega who happened to carry the King's mark, tolerated on the strength of Lily's attachment to her. She had become, through weeks of careful observation and quiet determination, someone whose judgment was genuinely valued, someone whose presence in strategy discussions was expected rather than merely permitted. Damien's own transformation toward her matched this shift, his early suspicion replaced entirely by something Elena found herself increasingly unable to name with any simplicity. He sought her company beyond the necessities of Lily's care or the ongoing investigation, finding reasons to walk with her through the stronghold's gardens, to share meals that had nothing to do with formal court obligations, to simply exist in her presence in ways that had little to do with duty at all. Elena noticed, too, how the rest of the household had begun to treat her differently, the wary suspicion of her earliest days replaced gradually by something closer to respect, even warmth from those who had come to know her through the long weeks of investigation and shared danger. Marisol had become something like a friend, sharing stories over tea, while Lily napped, offering gentle guidance on court customs Elena had never needed to understand before. Nolan, initially reserved and formal, now greeted her with genuine ease, occasionally even humor, treating her as a trusted member of the stronghold's inner circle, rather than an outsider requiring constant supervision. It was during a quiet evening in the garden courtyard, weeks after Victor Kane's capture, that Damien finally gave voice to what had been growing between them for so long. Lily had already been settled for the night, and the two of them had fallen into their now familiar habit of walking together beneath the stars, the mountain air crisp but no longer biting, with the harsh cold of the storm that had first brought them together. Damien stopped walking abruptly, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying none of the careful control she had grown used to seeing him wear in more formal settings. He told her, voice low and unusually uncertain for a man who commanded absolute authority over an entire territory, that he had spent years believing his position left no room for anything beyond duty and calculation, that a king's heart, if he allowed himself one at all, needed to remain secondary to the needs of his people and his bloodline. Elena listened, heart pounding, uncertain where this admission was leading, though some part of her had begun to suspect for weeks now. He continued, explaining that everything about her arrival had defied every careful expectation he had built his life around. She had appeared from nowhere, an omega with no rank or standing, and had somehow become essential, not just to Lily's survival, but to his own understanding of what genuine strength and loyalty looked like, qualities he had rarely encountered among the nobility and advisors who surrounded him daily. He admitted, finally, that his gratitude toward her had long since grown into something far deeper, something he had tried and failed repeatedly to dismiss as simple appreciation for her role in protecting his family. He could no longer pretend, standing here beneath the stars, that what he felt for her was anything less than genuine devotion. Elena's breath caught, emotions she had spent weeks trying to suppress rising to the surface all at once. She had told herself, again and again, that whatever warmth had grown between them was simply the natural result of shared danger and close proximity, that a king's attention meant nothing beyond momentary circumstance, that she would need to prepare herself for the inevitable return to whatever quiet, unremarkable life awaited her once the immediate crisis had passed. But standing here now, facing the raw honesty in Damien's expression, she found she could no longer maintain that careful distance either. She admitted, voice trembling slightly, that she had never expected to feel anything beyond fear and obligation within these walls, had never imagined that the king whose suspicion had greeted her so coldly on her first night here would come to mean something so significant to her. Yet here she stood, unable to deny the truth of her own feelings any longer, however impossible or complicated they might seem, given the vast difference in their stations. Damien closed the remaining distance between them, reaching out to gently take her marked wrist in his hand, tracing the crescent and crown symbol with a tenderness that stole whatever breath she had left. He told her that the mark had chosen her long before either of them understood what it truly meant, that whatever ancient magic governed such bonds had recognized something in her that he himself had only now fully come to see, something worthy not just of protecting his family, but of standing beside him as an equal. The moment stretched between them, fragile and profound, the weight of weeks of danger and uncertainty, finally giving way to something gentler, something Elena had never dared hope for during all those years of feeling invisible within her own pack. But even as she allowed herself to embrace this unexpected happiness, a distant part of her mind remained alert, remembering Victor Kane's unfinished threat, the contingency plan he had refused to reveal, still lurking somewhere beyond the walls of their fragile peace, waiting for the moment it would inevitably reveal itself. The attack came without warning, 3 weeks after that quiet night in the garden, shattering the fragile peace the stronghold had only just begun to rebuild. Elena woke in the darkest hours before dawn, to the sound of alarm horns echoing through the fortress, a deep, urgent sound she had never heard before, but understood instantly meant danger of the gravest kind. She was on her feet immediately, rushing to Lily's crib, before conscious thought fully caught up with her instincts, gathering the startled, crying baby into her arms, just as the door to her quarters burst open. Nolan stood there, sword already drawn, expression grim, in a way that told her everything she needed to know, before he even spoke. Victor Kane's contingency had finally revealed itself, a force of rogue soldiers, loyal to Victor's remaining allies outside the stronghold, had launched a coordinated assault on the fortress under cover of darkness, breaching the outer walls through a section Garion had apparently mapped for them weeks earlier, before his own betrayal was discovered. Their target, Nolan explained urgently, as he led Elena and Lily through the corridors toward the stronghold's most secure inner chamber, was clear. Eliminate Lily. eliminate Elena, and use the resulting chaos to free Victor Kane from his cell, before order could be restored. Elena's heart pounded as they moved swiftly through torchlit corridors, the distant sounds of clashing steel and shouted orders growing louder with each passing minute. She held Lily close, murmuring soft reassurances, even as her own fear threatened to overwhelm her, focusing every bit of her attention on reaching safety rather than the danger closing in around them. They had nearly reached the inner chamber when a group of intruders emerged from a side corridor, cutting off their path forward. Nolan positioned himself immediately between Elena and the approaching threat, calling for reinforcements even as he prepared to hold the line alone if necessary. Elena's mind raced. The inner chamber lay just beyond this corridor, tantalizingly close, but with intruders blocking the direct route. Reaching it safely seemed impossible without help arriving in time. She remembered, suddenly, the layout of the stronghold she had studied so carefully during the weeks of investigation into Victor Kane's network, remembered a narrow servant's passage that connected to the same chamber through a longer but far less obvious route. She told Nolan urgently, and he nodded grimly, understanding immediately what she intended. He would hold this corridor, buying her the time she needed to reach safety through the alternate path, trusting her to navigate it correctly, even under the extreme pressure of the moment. Elena ran, Lily clutched tightly against her chest, every instinct screaming at her to move faster, even as the narrow servant's passage forced her to slow her pace, to avoid stumbling in the dim light. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of Nolan's fierce defense, steel against steel, shouted commands, and she forced herself not to look back, focusing entirely on reaching the inner chamber, where Lily would finally be safe. She emerged from the passage just as Damien rounded the corner from the opposite direction, having fought his way through the chaos to reach them himself rather than wait for reports from a safe distance. Relief flooded his expression at the sight of them both unharmed, quickly replaced by fierce determination as he ushered them the final distance into the secure chamber, where several guards already stood ready to defend the entrance. Damien would not remain there long, Elena realized immediately. Despite her instinctive desire to keep him close, to keep everyone she cared about within reach during this chaos, she understood that his place was leading the defense of his stronghold, coordinating the response that would ultimately determine whether this attack succeeded or failed. He held her face gently for just a moment, forehead pressed briefly against hers, a wordless promise passing between them before he turned and disappeared back into the fighting, leaving Elena alone with Lily and the guards assigned to protect the inner chamber. The hours that followed felt endless, the sounds of battle gradually growing more distant, as Damien's forces pushed the intruders back toward the breached section of the outer wall. Elena held Lily close throughout, singing soft songs to keep the frightened baby calm, her own nerves stretched thin with worry, for Nolan, for Damien, for everyone fighting beyond these walls to protect a peace that had felt so fragile and hard-won. Dawn finally broke with the arrival of a guard bearing news that the attack had been repelled, the remaining intruders either captured or driven back beyond the stronghold's borders, and that Damien himself, though exhausted and bearing minor injuries, had survived the confrontation without serious harm. Elena's relief was so overwhelming she nearly wept, clutching Lily close, as the guard escorted them from the inner chamber back toward the main hall, where reports were already being gathered on the full scope of the attack and its aftermath. She found Damien there, overseeing the securing of the breached wall section, and the moment he saw her, whatever composure he had maintained throughout the crisis finally cracked. He crossed the hall in long, urgent strides, and pulled her and Lily both into his arms, holding them close with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could have managed. Nolan, she learned with profound relief, had survived his stand against the intruders in the corridor, wounded but expected to recover fully, his fierce defense having bought precisely the time Elena needed to reach safety with Lily. Victor Kane, attempting to escape his cell amid the chaos as his allies had intended, had been intercepted and recaptured before he could flee the stronghold entirely, his final desperate gambit ending in complete failure. As the sun rose fully over the mountain peaks, illuminating a stronghold battered but ultimately unbroken, Elena allowed herself, finally, to believe that the danger which had followed her and Lily since that first stormy night might truly be over. Victor Kane's trial took place 3 days later, in a formal gathering of the Stronghold's council and representatives from neighboring pact territories, all assembled to witness justice finally delivered for a betrayal that had nearly cost the royal bloodline everything. Elena attended alongside Damien, standing at his side rather than among the general assembly, a placement that drew murmured attention from nobles and advisors who had spent weeks speculating about her true role within the king's household. The evidence against Victor Kane proved overwhelming. The intercepted correspondence, the testimony of Garyon and the other captured conspirators, the failed assault on the stronghold itself, all combining into an undeniable picture of calculated treachery. Victor offered no meaningful defense, his composure finally breaking under the weight of complete exposure, revealing in his final desperate words a bitterness toward a succession system he believed had overlooked his ambitions for far too long. Damien's judgment was swift and final. Victor Kane stripped of all rank and privilege, exiled from the territory permanently, under conditions that would prevent him from ever again threatening the bloodline he had tried so hard to manipulate. The council's approval was unanimous, and Elena watched as a weight seemed to visibly lift from Damien's shoulders. Months of hidden danger finally resolved completely. But it was what happened after the formal proceedings concluded that Elena would remember most clearly for the rest of her life. Damien turned to address the assembled council and nobles directly, his expression carrying none of the guarded formality Elena had grown used to seeing him wear during official gatherings. He spoke first of Lily's rescue, praising the courage of an Omega who had risked everything to save a child she had never met, braving a brutal storm without hesitation when everyone else might have simply passed by. He spoke next of the weeks that followed, of insight and strength that had helped unravel a conspiracy his own trusted advisors had failed to detect, of quiet determination that had proven more valuable to the stronghold's safety than any amount of noble rank or inherited privilege. The assembled nobles listened with growing attention, murmurs rippling through the hall as they began to understand where his words were leading. Damien turned then, fully, to face Elena directly, and reached for her marked wrist, holding it up for the entire assembly to see clearly, the crescent and crown symbol catching the light streaming through the hall's tall windows. He announced, voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent chamber, that the mark she bore had never been simply about protecting Lily, though it had certainly served that purpose faithfully. He explained, with a conviction that left no room for doubt, that such marks appeared only for those the bloodline itself recognized as true partners, worthy not just of guardianship, but of standing beside the king, as an equal in every sense that mattered. He declared, before the entire assembled council, that Elena would be recognized formally as his chosen mate, elevated from her position as an unranked Omega to a status befitting the woman who had saved his family and proven her worth through courage and integrity that no inherited title could ever guarantee. The hall erupted into a mixture of astonished murmurs and, gradually, genuine approval, many among the council having witnessed firsthand over the preceding months exactly how much Elena had contributed to unraveling Victor Kane's conspiracy and protecting the bloodline they all served. Elena stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what was happening, memories flooding through her of years spent believing herself invisible and unworthy within her own pack, of a life defined by low expectations and quiet dismissal. None of that history had prepared her for this moment, standing before an entire court as the chosen partner of the most powerful man in the region. But as she looked at Damien, at the genuine warmth and pride in his expression, and down at Lily, held securely in Marisol's arms nearby, watching the proceedings with the innocent curiosity only a baby could manage, Elena understood that this moment had never truly been about status or rank at all. It had been about a single choice, made in the middle of a brutal storm, to run toward a stranger's cry rather than walk away. Everything that followed, the mark, the danger, the growing bond with Damien, the family she had never expected to find, had all flowed from that one act of instinctive courage. She met Damien's gaze and nodded, accepting the future he offered her not because of the power or status it carried, but because somewhere in the weeks since that stormy night, she had come to genuinely love this man, this child, and the life they had built together despite every obstacle placed in their path. The council's approval, when formally voted, was unanimous, and as the assembled nobles rose to acknowledge Elena's new position, she felt Damien's hand find hers, steady and warm, a silent promise of everything still to come. Later that evening, as the celebrations finally quieted, and the stronghold settled into peaceful rest for the first time in months, Elena stood once more in the garden courtyard, where Damien had first confessed his feelings, Lily sleeping soundly in her arms, the mountain stars bright and clear overhead. Damien joined her there, wrapping his arms around them both, and Elena allowed herself, finally and completely, to believe in the life stretching ahead of her. She had entered a storm, as an overlooked omega, with nothing to her name, and had emerged as something she never dared imagine, a protector, a partner, and finally, truly, a family. The mark on her wrist no longer felt like a mystery or a burden. It felt, at last, like exactly what it had always been meant to be, a promise fulfilled, chosen not by blood or rank, but by courage, loyalty, and a heart brave enough to run toward a cry for help in the middle of the darkest storm.